Welcome again to Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 8. I'm Charley Walters. Yvonne Vaillancourt is with me today in the studio. She's the director of the UMass Boston Nantucket Field Station. And if you've ever wondered what goes on out there, you're about to find out. Thank you for coming in, Yvonne.
Thanks for having me, Charley.
What do you do out there?
Well, there's a lot of things that go out at the field station. To start off with, we are part of UMass Boston, part of the School for the Environment. And so we run courses for our students. We also support a lot of research by UMass researchers, but also by a lot of other people from different agencies, institutions, and nonprofits as well.
How many students might you have at a given time from UMass Boston?
That depends. So if they're coming for an overnight stay, that's limited by housing. And normally those groups would be a bit smaller, somewhere between, maybe 8 to 22 people, depending on the time of year. In the summer, we usually acquire some supplemental housing, so we can bring in slightly bigger groups. But normally, the type of activities that are best supported at a place like the field station tend to be smaller groups where you can get around easily in one or two vehicles, and also you have a lot more personal interaction with a smaller group of students. So usually it's about 14 people, but it could be 10. And
some of them stay out there at the field station.
Yes.
And some don't, I guess, if there are too many.
Yeah, most of the time they're all at the field station in our bunkhouse. So the station has a dormitory, and it's an old summer house, basically, with bunk beds, and that's where a class will stay. So in the summertime, we tend to run usually about 4 courses, sometimes more, back to back in sequence. So it's one class at a time. And some lucky students come out for more than one course. So they could potentially spend the whole summer on the island if they were taking all of the courses in a row. Most don't, though. And they would live in that house together. So it's sort of a group house, and they often will make group meals, but not always. And we have a laboratory right there at the station, and a fleet of vehicles. So we move the students and the faculty around who are teaching the courses, as well as largely do what we're doing right there on the grounds.
Well, now that the word is out that housing is provided, you may see a spike in your applications, given how difficult housing is in this town. No, I'm just kidding. How big is UMass Boston? When you say 14 or 20 people, that's out of a total enrollment of?
We have about, actually, this fall, I think the number was 15,671,
Really?
if I remember correctly. That was our undergraduate enrollment. The graduate enrollment is about 3,500, I think. So, yeah, it's funny. We're probably about the size of our year-round population here, comparable.
Well, now, is that all at Columbia Point in Boston?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when people drive up on the Southeast Expressway, whether they know it or not, they're driving right by UMass Boston.
That's correct. Yeah. It's really a beautiful location, and so is our campus down here on Nantucket.
It certainly is, and we'll talk about more about that shortly. Is this open to the public? If somebody wants to go out to that property,
yes,
and walk around, it is open to the public on a year-round basis?
It is. We're open year-round. Our hours are posted on the sign as you drive onto the drive. But yeah, we're open 9 to 5 in the winter, 9 to 7 in the summertime. There is a visitor lot as you drive down on the grounds, and you can park at the visitor lot. There's a gate beyond which is really managed by the field station. And that's where you'll find the lab and the dorm, and the public is welcome there every day of the year, and you can walk on the trails and on the beach. You can enjoy the space. We have plenty of chairs. You can sit down and enjoy the view of the marsh, of Folger's Marsh, or of the harbor. There's picnic tables. We just ask that you take with you what you bring in, and that you don't take anything extra off of the ground. So like other conservation spaces and parks. What's there should stay there and isn't there to be removed. So it's a protected sanctuary.
Well, it's a nice area. I've walked those trails, and what struck me more than anything else was how large it is out there. How many acres do you have out there?
It's about 110.
Really, that big?
I've seen different numbers through different documents. I think currently it's called 107, but I know that in the past the documentation stated 110, and that parcel came to UMass in 1963. It was, half of it, I should say, or a portion of it, was given to the school from the Stephen J. Peabody family. And the other part came in 1964, and that came from the Catherine Cole Folger family. And collectively, that makes up the parcel. And so UMass has been part of the Nantucket, community since 1963.
That's when the field station was instituted, inaugurated?
That's when they received the land. I think the first courses didn't occur for a couple of years, but the first caretakers started shortly after that, and the property came with all the structures that are currently out there. The first caretakers were Ginger Andrews' parents, Clint and Edith Andrews. And so she has quite a connection as well to the field station. And it's always a pleasure to chat with her about her time at the station too.
Well, the ownership of that land is not with UMass Boston anymore, correct?
That's correct. In 2004, UMass sold the land to the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. And with that parcel agreement, the UMass Boston retains the right to be there. We still own all the structures and have the responsibility for them and all the infrastructure that's part of that.
Including the paths and the trails?
There's an interesting contract that came with that parcel agreement. So we have a lot of responsibility and maintain the grounds that are north of the gate as part of that agreement. And we have the right to maintain our buildings or expand them. We certainly need to pick up the dorm and move it or replace it as that bluff erodes like a lot of places on the island. We're fortunate in that respect, though, that our rate of erosion is a lot less right there compared to other parts of the island. But it is decreasing, as I'm sure you've seen through the years. So.
Let's talk about that, because you're on the building closest to the water is on a bit of a bluff. It's not, in other words, it's not at beach level, but it's not at 50 feet above beach level. How close to the water is it as we speak?
Well, actually, the closest building to the water was the former office of the field station director. So when I came on board, that had already been sort of boarded up, and we were told don't use it. That is the oldest building on the property, and it's a little beach house down by the beach, actually. So there is one structure that's very close to the water. It's not in use. I would love to salvage it if possible, but that is a building that we need to deal with in one way or another.
Well, I guess I'm thinking of the building where the bunk beds are and the kitchen, but that's not what you're talking about.
I'm not talking about that building. I'm talking about the 1901 or 1910 building. It's the oldest little cottage there. And it would be nice to salvage it, relocate it, and rebuild it if possible, but I'm not sure that will happen. I'd love to see that. The dormitory is the one that's up on the bluff. Okay. We use that. The building's fine. It's about 30 feet or less in spots from the bluff.
From the bluff?
From the bluff.
And it's not a particularly wide beach there, is it? So
no, it's probably maybe 20 meters, so 30 to 40 feet wide, that beach.
And how fast is that eroding?
The bluff, we lose about 7 to 9 inches a year on average. It's an average, so some years we don't see much loss at all, but then you'll get a large clump of it falling every once in a while, although those clumps seem to be just falling a foot or two and aren't disappearing after that. They seem to be lessening the incline, but there's no doubt that one large hurricane could really take a lot of that away. So we do need to move that soon, I would say, in the next few years.
Really? Well, you have plenty of room in which to move it, but you have some protection there because even though you're facing north, more or less, you have code 2.
Yeah.
So it could be a lot worse. Not that it's good, not to say that it's good, but there's some protection there. But other parts of the property on the west involve Folger's Marsh, which is closer to sea level. And talk about that.
Yeah, Folger's Marsh is a beautiful marsh. A lot of, you asked earlier about what goes on out there. And so a fair amount of our courses and people who come out to do research work in the marsh, study the marsh. It's a beautiful, fairly, pristine environment. But as marshes exist, they're wonderful. They absorb a lot of water when there's storm surges. They perform a really important function protecting the terrestrial space nearby by absorbing all this water. The problem with sea level rise, and we see, that marsh looking more and more like a lake at high tides each month, is that if you inundate the edges where you do not have a lot of plants that are tolerant of salt water, you could cause a lot of harm, or you could see harm being done by the surges and the large amounts of salt water that haven't historically been there. So plants can actually not do very well and die off. You could get a lessening of the stability of what is actually the marsh, those things that make it up. A positive thing that could be done at Folger's Marsh would be to raise the road and to open the culvert a little bit, at least clean out the culvert more routinely and let the water flow to the southern side of that marsh. So the marsh is intersected by a road. It actually continues on the other side of the road.
The Pulpus Road.
Yeah. So to do its job as a marsh, it could absorb more of that water at high tide or during storm surges than it currently does because it's blocked at the road. So that would be, I think, a smart thing to do and to let sort of nature do its job. And that would be a healthy thing for the marsh as well.
Well, you say there's a culvert going underneath the road. Is that almost full on a typical day? Yeah.
I mean, in really high waters, it can actually reach, you'll have an inability for the storm waters to drain out, and you could have a little bit of flooding on Pulpus Road itself. That's not very frequent, but it can happen. But there's routinely days where I'll take a picture and post it on our Facebook website or our Facebook site, showing just how high the water is. It kind of keeps a nice record as well. I mean, it's still not reaching us. It's I don't feel threatened by the height of it, but it's definitely noticeable and something that we can see more and more.
Let me talk about that property a little more, because when it goes through the culvert to the south side of the road, is that still private property? I mean, is that part of your property?
That's no.
Okay.
So the field station parcel as an entity stops at Pulpus Road, but the marsh itself on the other side of Pulpus Road, I think is owned by NCF, and maybe in part by land bank. I know there's a land bank marker in that vicinity, and I think it's those two organizations that collectively own the rest of that marsh. I could be wrong.
How far back does that marsh go? Because when you're driving on the road, your eyes are automatically drawn to the north side, where the most visible water is, and there are birds and so on. But how much is on the south side of Pulpus Road?
I don't know the exact acreage, but I don't think it's quite as large as the northern side of it. But it's sizable. It definitely is probably at least half the size of what's north of it, is my guess. And, what surrounds it is a pretty steep incline, I think. There is a road that runs along the eastern edge of it, and I'm not sure how elevated that is fully away from that marsh, but it is elevated above it.
It is elevated. You sort of go down. If you're going out of town, you go down, and then you come up past the marsh, and there's a house, or probably more than that. But to the left, about where that big house is, that's how you get into the field station, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. It's a long driveway. You can't really see the buildings from the road, can you?
You can if you're down by the Life-Saving Museum.
Okay.
Or if you're visiting the Life-Saving Museum and you look across the marsh, from some views you can see the laboratory, you can see the director's residence, you can see the little beach house. Yeah, that oldest house that isn't currently being used is right down at the water's edge. And it's an iconic image. A lot of artists have painted it. A lot of people are familiar with the view of it, but from the water, you can certainly see most of not the lab, but from the road, you can see the lab. And for maybe a few seconds as you drive by. But as you go down that driveway, which is, I think, from Pulpus Road to the end, it's about half a mile. But
it's longer than you might guess if you're standing on Pulpus Road. It's, well, as you say, over 100 acres.
Right.
Within the UMass system, not just UMass Boston, but all the branches of UMass, is having this field station unusual? Are there other field stations within the Commonwealth?
It's not the most common thing. We're quite lucky as a university system to have a field station. We have another one within the UMass system. There's one in Gloucester, but it's very different. It's not at all like this field station. And part of that is by design. Redundancy within the university system is not something they like. So the UMass Gloucester field station is a old fish cannery. It doesn't have big acreage. It's mostly a structure, a laboratory, and they have maybe some boats and some facilities up there in Gloucester, but it's very different from ours. And then there was a station in Waltham that was more of a greenhouse and garden space, for growing plants and experimenting on plants. So field stations can be really different. They're gateways to some sort of resource outside. And ours is not only, to that magnificent parcel, which is really beautiful and full of microhabitats that are very valuable to education and research, but also it's a gateway to this whole island, which is, we're lucky to have as much open space as we do, which is also available for research. And many people come out, and it's also fostered by our collective of people here that bring other people to the island or encourage people to come here to use these spaces. So our station is a real gem for our UMass system. There's no doubt about it. We have people from all of the campuses that come out. Most of them are from UMass Boston, but Dartmouth, Amherst, and sometimes Lowell. We also see people from all of those different UMass campuses, but it's one of many field stations. So we're members of the Organization for Biological Field Stations, but also for the National Association of Marine Labs. So I meet routinely with people in similar positions, and it's really interesting to talk to colleagues who have similar jobs in these sometimes remote, sometimes not so remote areas that provide access, basically, and facilities. So if you're trying to do research away from your main campus in an environment, you usually need more than a hotel can provide. And coming here, you also need it to be affordable.
Yes.
So we do that for a lot of people. And, like I said earlier, we spend a lot of time with students, either having them come out and take courses here, or their courses might visit for a weekend. We also have interns, and our interns, coming from the Boston campus, are actually year-round interns. So they are not usually in residence all the time, but they could be here at any weekend or any given point based on their schedule. And that's nice. That's nice that they can come out. We're open year-round, and a lot of different researchers come out at different points of the year. So those hybrid interns get to experience interactions with a lot of different people doing a lot of different things.
When the students come out here, are the teachers already here, or the teachers come as well?
In the summer, when they're taking classes, the way our courses are set up is the instructor comes out and is here that whole time with them. Sometimes it's taught by more than one person, so they might switch off, but they're all here together. So it's all in person. The intent is for it to be more hands-on, to be out in the environment, using the tools and the equipment out in the field as well as in the laboratory, and also meeting people here on the island, other researchers or people who live here year-round. That we have so many wonderful people and great nonprofits that do all kinds of science and conservation space management, that our students are very lucky to be able to learn from them as well. So that's part of what goes on when we have classes. They're often introduced to other people, and they meet their interns as well. So it's a really wonderful networking opportunity.
You've had your job since 2016, and at least in my time here, there haven't been very many people with your job. People tend to come here and stay with the job. It's easier for me to understand why that is, but how did you happen to get this job? Because you did not grow up here. First of all, where did you grow up?
Right. I'm not from Nantucket originally. I grew up in New Hampshire.
Nobody is from Nantucket. It's like New York City. Nobody was born there.
I grew up in New Hampshire, and I have been with UMass Boston for, since 1992. So I was there working in the biology department, and had come and gone to Nantucket quite a few times back in the 90s mostly, and really loved it. I mean, I often was part of a group that was bringing students back and forth. And so at the time, the first director, Wes Tiffany, was here. I think, yes, I'm only number 3. It was Wes, Tiffany, with Susan Beagle that were here at the time. And that was when UMass owned all the land. And then Sarah Octai came on board when Wes retired. And that was about 2003, maybe, 2004, right around the time that the school sold the land. And then when Sarah moved on, which was in 2015, the position became available. And I really didn't expect to get an interview. I applied for the job.
You did apply?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yes. It was a regular search. And I just thought, well, I have to try. It seems like a really great job, and was an interesting location. I really enjoy Nantucket. It's a nice combination of rural, but also, coming out of Boston. I had lived in Boston for quite a few years at that point, or in the vicinity. And Nantucket is, on its busiest day, isn't as busy as the city, so that it worked for me. I really do enjoy being here, and I don't feel isolated at all. And maybe that comes from growing up in a rural environment, but it's a very charming environment. But it's also intellectually, for me, a very satisfying place to be. I'm very dedicated to public service in the public education sector. I am happy to be providing access and trying hard to improve that for students, getting more students here, and working with the community here as well. I'm always open to working with teachers. We have a lot of the private schools come out and will do a session with us or have a walk. Some people prefer to have an unstructured thing that they do, and that's fine. The public school is also an entity I'd love to see come out more. I know that's harder with larger classes, and it's expensive and logistically challenging, but we welcome students. We've had a number of local kids that, as high school students, can intern with me or spend time at the station if they're really interested in the types of things we do. There's also been college students that are Nantucketers that, they go away to college, but when they're here in the summer, they can intern with me as well. So we usually have 1 or 2 of those, sometimes more interest. And then there's some students that are in college, but they wrap up the end of their, or one of their requirements, which is to do an internship. So I've had some students that are not UMass students, they're Nantucketers. They're from another school, but they can, through an arrangement between the schools, actually fulfill that requirement and do
get
work.
credit, I assume,
Yes.
is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I've done that before, and we do it with our own students. And students can get internships externally, so they can do them with other schools as well. But you do have to fulfill their requirements. Mm-hmm.
You spoke a few minutes ago about having been involved with UMass for, 30 years or more than that. Talk some more about what you did during those 30 years before you took this job.
So I came to UMass as a student.
UMass Boston?
Yes, UMass Boston. As a college student, I wasn't sure what I wanted to study. I enjoyed learning. So I liked a lot of different courses, and my route to determining that biology was what I would ultimately study took a while. I really enjoy the humanities, and I finally arrived at that decision, and at that point I transferred. So I had started at a community college. I grew up blue collar. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I liked to take classes, so I went to where they were cheapest. And in the 80s, they were real cheap at a community college. So I that was good. That was a smart move. And then I went to university where it was a little more expensive, and I was out of state, so that first year was pricey. But I got a work-study job on campus. That's how I first started there. And I thought, oh, this is nice. I'm in school. I graduated, but the year that I was a senior, I got a technician job, and I thought, I'll do this for a few years.
Well, technician in this context would mean what?
I was setting up laboratories for all the different classes that ran in the biology department. So in one building, but they were mostly mid and upper level courses. And so that was satisfying. You learned a lot. You worked with a lot of different people. I like to work with people. And from that point, I didn't think I was going to do that for very long, but I did. because working at a university is a nice environment if you like that kind of thing. And I did. It also came with the ability to take classes. So I began to take graduate classes and was working on some projects with sponges and continued on that track. I worked a lot and began to shift in my role. So I went from a technician to a lab coordinator and then to a lab director. That was the role I was in when I applied for this job. And so I felt very fortunate, but also that it was a good environment environmentally, because I'm very interested in the marine realm. So some of the work that I'm doing here is more in the intertidal, which is what I was working on, in my spare time back then.
Well, I want to hear more about that, what you're doing here, because before the show, you said that most of your work was administrative or managerial. I can't remember what adjective you used, but you are able to do personal projects as well as direct the facility. So I want to hear more about those personal projects.
Yeah, that's right. So the job is 80% management of the space. That's what the director does. You're responsible for all that coordination and keeping it running and all that, and representing the school here among our partners. But the other 15 to 20% of your time, you're permitted to do research. And so, you can write for small grants, you can collaborate. We do a lot of monitoring. Early on, the station as an entity did a lot of things that are nice to keep going long term, but many of those things are now done by other nonprofits on the island, and that's a good thing. But like Sarah, my predecessor, the second director, Sarah Octai, did a lot of water quality work, and that now we have a water quality specialist on staff as part of the island's natural resources in the town.
In other words, you're not working just on your property, you're working everywhere around the island?
Oh, so I don't want to confuse. Yeah, that's correct. So,
Okay.
So the projects that I work on aren't necessarily the things that were always ongoing in the past. So things shift with different directors, but also with different community initiatives. And so as the local science staff and entities grow and take on more of that type of monitoring, we shift a little bit. But then there are things that we still maintain. My interests are working with the Natural Resources Department. So there is a project that is going very slowly, but I'm working on...
That's the town's natural... Not part of UMass, it's Town of Nantucket Natural Resource Department.
So Tara Riley is fantastic to work with. And so we have a project together trying to quantify the enhancement of the scallops. That my part in that is a long-term project. It's taken a long time. I'd like to wrap that one up, but it's just looking at, can you determine, if the spat they're releasing can be accounted for in the harvest or not. So that's a tricky question, and we knew that. It looks pretty obvious, like that it's working. Yes, they do a great job, but trying to really quantify that is a little complicated. That's one project. Juanita Urban-Rich is a professor out of Boston that I work with, and we've been funded locally by the Land Council and by Remain Nantucket a number of years in a row doing microplastics work. So that's a newer thing. That wasn't something people were doing earlier. That's important.
What are you finding?
It's here comparably to what you see in other parts of the Cape, so across Nantucket Sound. So the first few years we were establishing the baseline, like how much of that is here. And then some of her graduate students would focus on particular questions, like is it in the air? That was Nick Warner's work. He got a master's looking at that. And there is some in the air. Is it in the water column? And it is. Is it in the sand in the beach? And it is. But it's in smaller quantities than other parts of the world, but it's there. So we wanted to establish how much of that is present. And really, Juanita is the best person to talk to about this. We work jointly, but I would defer to her answering particulars. And she's here a lot. She was just here at Science Fest at the high school, working, showing people about how microplastics are generated naturally by the sand gritting up against them as they weather. And she comes back and forth quite a bit. So do her grad students. She's also looked at, are they, in oysters? Are they in other shellfish? And oysters can actually spit them back out, but they
what
are—
about scallops or mussels or whatever?
Scallops are less of an issue because you eat the mussel. So as long as you're just taking that mussel out and rinsing it, you're not ingesting what they ingest. But the amount that you would encounter is not very much. It's a low number. So the idea is more about how harmful is the plastic harmful, and how does that work if it is to the shellfish itself, if they are taking it in because it's in the water column, is it leaching or not? And so those are kind of the current questions. We can't really say for humans what that means because it's still a very low amount.
That was going to be my next question. What about if you are what you eat and the shellfish or whatever have it in them, how much of it is sticking around in us?
Yeah.
And we're talking about things we can't see, correct?
Right. They're really small.
They're there, but you can't see them.
A microplastic is by definition something that's smaller than 5 millimeters. So you could see some of the larger fragments. And then down to, below a certain size, they become a different category. They're nanoparticles instead. But again, it's something I'm part of, but really Juanita is the specialist, and she is more of an authority than me. But I'm comfortable saying that, the concern, the level that we see, the concern is really more of a question about, is it a problem for the oysters or the scallops? It's small enough. And like I was saying, the oysters have been documented being able to spit back out some of the plastics. That's a oversimplification, but it's important
well, for
work.
a layperson, it makes sense. I mean, it certainly made sense to me, your description of what you're doing. What else are you doing?
So the things that I really...
Or have you done while you're here?
Yeah, we're looking at eelgrass like everybody else, I guess. So that's not a new thing, but it's very important. And eelgrass meadows, seagrass meadows in general, I think are really as important as the marshes.
And that's because?
They do a lot. They are a very valuable habitat for the shellfish, like the scallops. They also lessen some of the waves. Anything in the water that's growing can help to break up some of the force of the water hitting the shore. Not as much as something like an oyster reef, but they're really important because of the habitat they provide, and because they absorb carbon, they absorb nutrients. They also are affected by too much nutrient load. So I think the health of our eelgrass is something that we're all really concerned about. And the environments here are really important to be monitoring as we look at changes in them due to climate change. As the temperature goes up, as we see more storm surges, and as more and more people are here, understanding our environment, how it works, and the changes we see as other things change around them is really important if we're going to keep them healthy and viable. And so eelgrass is a a large and important part of our environment for those reasons, for the not just for the scallops and the crabs and the fish, but it absorbs a lot of things out of the water too.
Going back to Folgers Marsh, what you see a lot of birds, obviously, as you drive by, but what are we not seeing that's in the water?
The marsh itself, so the grasses you see in particular in the summer and in the fall, they're really important for providing that habitat for the birds. But the birds are there because they're feeding on all kinds of things that thrive in the marsh, and including lots of mussels live at the base of all that grass. A lot of crabs. There's probably quite a bit of shellfish underneath the sediment.
What kind of shellfish
Probably
would you see there?
Closer to the beach more than inside the marsh, but you would probably have clams. There's a lot of fiddler crabs on the edges, which you've probably seen. But yeah, if you look at the base of the grass that's on the edge of the creek, or where there's a lot of water in the marsh, not necessarily right at the creek, but in areas where there's pans and things, you'll see a lot of mussels. And they're usually the ribbed mussel, not the blue mussel that we love to eat. They're the other larger ones that you see.
Well, I've seen mussels on the jetties, on the west side of the West Jetty. And I've seen other mussels out in the Hallover area. And they don't look the same. It's the lagoon area, as I call it. They're larger and they're a different color. First of all, what kind do you see in the marsh, and what's the difference?
So the ones that tend to make up a important layer at the base of the grasses in the marsh are usually these mussels that are not smooth. They have ridges on them that run the length of the mussel. They're called ribbed mussels. Commonly, they're usually Gukensia or something like that. Middleus is the blue mussel. That's very shiny, purpley, dark color. And they all have those threads that you call the beard, the byssal threads that attach them to other substrates, whether it's the grass or a rock at jetties. So it could be that you're seeing Middleus or another type of mussel similar to them, smoother, out at the jetties, and things like the rib mussels you tend to see in the marshes. Sometimes, though, where you have a major difference in current, you'll see the same species take on a slightly different shape. I'm not sure that applies to mussels. But sometimes it's a better environment, so you might see them growing larger in some spaces. But I'm guessing at the jetties, what you're seeing is Middleus, and what is in the marsh is usually Gukensia, that really big one. Sometimes it's another type of ribbed mussel. There's also horse mussels, which are similar to the blue mussel, but wider, and they have brown on them. Yeah, and then, we also see a lot of burrowing shellfish, bivalves. So we have a lot of razor clams, but that's really on the edge of the beach where there's sort of the creek meets the harbor. You'll see a lot of shells there, and I think if you watch the birds, you'll see that they're feeding on all kinds of things. A lot of crabs, lots of spider crabs. We do have green crabs, but we're seeing more blue crabs out there too. Lots of hermit crabs, fiddler crabs, and it's really laden with conch shells as well. So you'll see moon snails and channel whelks and knob whelks, lots of snails out in that environment, both in the eelgrass, but also on the edge of the marsh.
There's a lot out there. I didn't know this. This is fascinating. And I'm assuming that you can't just go out and fish in Folgers Marsh.
Inside the marsh, it's more protected. So anywhere on the water, if you're in a vessel on the water, you can enter and fish. But you should be really cognizant of these fragile natural resources that exist that protect and filter the water. They also protect the land, and they provide habitat. And really, they're kind of nurseries for all of these other fish and shellfish and things that start off really small in these protected environments like a marsh or an eelgrass bed. And then as they get larger, they move out into deeper water. So I think, yes, you can come in there if you're on the water. But I think it's nice to envision that there are some places worth keeping as a sanctuary, so things have a chance to expand and thrive, and then, expand from that point.
Now, you've been here about 8 years, and you were here before that on a temporary basis. In your view, is Nantucket being loved to death?
Yeah, it would seem.
Not to put you on the spot, but I think it is myself.
Yeah, it's quite noticeable how many people are here in the summertime and how busy we are more and more, starting earlier and earlier, I should say, and then going later and later beyond the summer. And during those peak months, we see a lot of people. I mean, certainly out at the station, there's a lot of visitation. And I know we're rather remote and a little outside of town, so if we're seeing that many people, there's even more in town. We all know that. And there's quite a need to balance that. And I do have concerns about the ability for our space and our resources to support that type of impact from that many people. Whether you're talking about nutrient load, people being here, your presence ends up in the waterway. It does for all of us. But also, all of the water we all use, going up and down the roads in your vehicles, your tires, particularly, and end up in the stormwater. Like, everything we do has an impact. And that's part of life. But when you put lots and lots of people together, that impact on a small space is hard for that space to maintain through time if it can't replenish.
Good words to remember. Yvonne Vaillancourt, thank you very much for coming in. This has been more than informative, and I'm glad I finally convinced you to do it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Good. For Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 8, I'm Charley Walters. Thanks for tuning in. Please tune in again.